You know when you've just got a bunch of miniatures stashed at the back of the cupboard and you think, I'm gonna start painting them this weekend? Well, today's video is about my process of painting some URUK HAI warriors to get them done for the tabletop. I'm going to test out an armor color scheme using the Army Painter metallic speed paints. I will be doing the base coats with an airbrush, but you can follow along with just a standard brush, or for 3 alternative methods you can check out this video that I made for the channel a little while ago. These speed paints go through the airbrush wonderfully well, and if you add a little bit of 𝘉𝘂 airbrush thinner, it's great for making these paints even more translucent and they last that little bit longer. Just like on this 𝘉𝘂𝗵𝗿 purple that we're using. This purple is going to be the start of the shading for the metals, so I'm not looking to cover all of the previous base coats that we've laid down, but just to give it a tint of colour here and there, and especially between the armour plates and underneath the arms. I decided now would be a good time to base coat the actual skin for the URUK HAI, and I decided to go for a more reddish skin tone base colour rather than the more muted plum tones that I use for my URUK HAI scouts. Just for that little bit of variety. And another reason why I did the skin now is that I knew that I would get some of this colour onto the actual armour itself. So the final shading colour of Grim Black is actually going to cover this up. See, I think about these things. Now for these miniatures, they're not going to be perfect, they're just going to be done, really. They're going to be like a tabletop plus kind of standard. Which is why I went down the airbrush route for the majority. Do a bit of dry brushing, pick out a few details, and a couple highlights at the end, and they will be ready to go. I just want to base coat the last few elements such as the hair, the boots, and the gloves, and this is going to be done in black. I think I've now come across a process that I like to use whilst airbrushing, and that is to lay down any metallics first, and then afterwards go from a light to a darker colour. I think mainly because these darker colours act as both a shade and they cover up any mistakes that I might do. But what it doesn't cover is forgetting to paint an arm, so I'm just gonna do that now. After playing around with these speed paints a while ago, I discovered that they are pretty awesome if you want to go for a slight weathered look or a battered armoured look, because the paints do reactivate with water. However, this doesn't work with the Speed Paints 2.0 formula, which are the metallic colours in this case. So using a slightly damp brush, we're able to take off some of the black and the purple off the top surface of the metals, and thus making it slightly brighter. Keeping the 𝘉𝘂𝗵𝗿 brush in hand, now we're going to create a slightly weathered and battered looking URUK HAI armour. At this point I'm kind of stippling / patting on the bristles, rather than doing clean brushstrokes, just so that it gives it a slight texture and an uneven finish, which will be a bit different from our cleaner looking Minas Tirith warriors, even though we are using similar silver colours. I also picked out the chainmail as we still had the silver paint at hand, because this is going to be a base coat for a speed paint metallic later on. So I'm just trying to think one step ahead and save time in the long run. Remember everyone, always keep a 𝘉𝘂𝗵𝗿 brush after you think it's just about died, because you never know. There's always a use for something. As this miniature is around about 80% metal, I'm gonna throw on a highlight or two here or there. And that was done with some shining silver. I'm not going to highlight every single edge and corner for the chaff troops, but I probably will do for the heroes like the captains and of course 𝘱𝘀𝘃𝑒 boy. And as the metals on the armour were done relatively quickly, especially when batching a group of 10 together, this will then allow me to spend a little bit more time picking out some of the details like the cloth, the skin and the straps later on. So this tabletop standard plus will be fine and dandy for my troops. The final part of this video for the metals is to pick out the chainmail. Now I definitely wanted this to not be silver so it can stand apart from the rest of the silver of the shield, sword and armour. And I went for a bronzy look by applying some hardened leather speed paint over the plate mail metal that we painted earlier on. And finally, to brighten this up a little bit more, some weapons bronze was lightly dry brushed onto the texture of the chainmail. This will just add a bit more interest onto the miniature because the rest of it is going to be relatively dark, with it being silver and black. For the more reddish skin tone, I tried something a little bit different. And that was to use airbrush paints, but still using a brush. As these paints are already pre-thinned, they don't need to be watered down at all, so when you're using them with a brush, they can lay it up pretty well. And for this instance, as each brush stroke is laid down on the muscles, I'm just building up the colour lighter and lighter. I have to say that they're probably more forgiving than a normal acrylic paint, because it goes on slightly translucent and you see the colour underneath. You're less likely to put on a thick layer and then go completely wrong. For the hair, I didn't do anything too fancy, I just used an old manky brush and then dry brushed a couple of greys on. And for all of the straps, they were painted with a light brown. This will separate them from the black and copper colours that we've already got going on, but it will also stand out against the reddish skin tones. The other leather elements such as the belt, the shoes and his gloves were kept black. But I used a different coloured grey to highlight them, just to make them ever so slightly different from his hair. And this was highlighted with a slightly warmer tone of field grey, rather than the more coldish bluish tones of wolf grey for the hair. There's just a couple more details on Oliver the URUK HAI that need to be picked out. And luckily for the cloth, as well as the facial features, it will be a dark brown base coat. I don't think I'm going to pick out the eyes on these helmeted URUK HAI like I did with the scouts, well, just because they're bog standard troops and I just don't see the point because Legolas and Gimli are going to kill them pretty quickly anyway. But I certainly will pick out their lovely gnashes, because, well, URUK HAI have great looking teeth. Likewise for the hair and the belt, I'm not going to spend too much time on the cloth, but instead of a brown highlight, I'm going to go for more of a punchy pink colour. This way it stands out quite nicely against all the other colours. And also another nifty little tip for your highlights to stand out, as well as defining the edges of the materials on the miniature, is to paint a black shadow line. And now I have the beginning stages of a mighty URUK HAI army, ready to take on the defenders of Helm's Deep.